Greetings, Quester, and welcome to the Quest Report with Matt and Richard.
So welcome to this week's episode of the Quest Report. Today we're going to be talking about two very similar games, Mythos Tales and Sherlock Holmes. And Richard here is just reading the paper from one of the other of them.
I was just reading the paper for today, March the 12th, 1888. I was going to read out some of these headlines, but I thought it might be a little bit scary to some if you live nearby. It's talking about a fire in New York here, but I don't think that hasn't. It's alright. That hasn't happened.
That hasn't really
there
happened.
No. And there's a new polar expedition that looks quite interesting. So yeah, there's a lot going on in this newspaper, but only some of it is relevant to the case. And this paper comes with the first casebook for Consulting Detective, which is this game, a Sherlock Holmes game. Now, this first case is called the Munitions Magnet. And so it's a guy who has been murdered, and his family have come to ask Sherlock Holmes to investigate it for them. Now, this happened on the 12th of March 1888. So in this book, the storybook of it, you get the newspaper from that day, and you have all that. And we found that sometimes there is quite a vital clue in there, isn't there? But pretty hidden.
Do some digging. So just to give a basic overview of these two games, because they are both very similar. They're both investigation games. Obviously, one is set in the world of Sherlock Holmes. The other is Mythos Tales, so we're talking about Arkham and the Lovecraftian mythos. They're actually so incredibly similar that, I mean, I've described Mythos Tales as basically being Sherlock Holmes with tentacles before. They both have the same core mechanics of going to a location, which you do by reading an entry from the casebook. You've got a map. In this case, you've both. This one is London, and for Mythos Tales, obviously it's a map of Arkham. You go to a location, you read an entry from that casebook. Both investigations are scored, so at the end of your investigation, you'll have questions to answer and be given a score for getting questions right. You can suffer penalties. In the case of Mythos Tales, for visiting places that damage your sanity. In the case of Sherlock Holmes, actually in both cases, if you visit too many locations, more than the respective investigators. So in Sherlock Holmes, if you visit more locations than Sherlock did, and in Mythos Tales, if you visit more locations than Professor Armitage, in both of those you then get penalties on your points for having visited too many locations or unnecessary locations.
I think one of the basic things is that it's cooperative, isn't it? You were doing that as a group, so it's like we were all going to visit these locations, and it's very much like kind of a choose your own adventure type book.
It is. You can actually play them competitively as well, so you can play all together. You can play it so that you're all doing it competitively and you're all trying to get the highest score, in which case it doesn't necessarily flow as well, because what happens is the person whose turn it is gets to decide where you're all going to go, where you're going to read. Now, because you've got a limited amount of time, if Richard wants to go to one place, because we're playing it competitively, and I decide, no, I'm not going to take us there, I'm going somewhere else entirely, which is exactly the kind of thing I would do.
Probably is, yeah.
Then, Richard's going to be there frustrated, thinking, oh, I'm running out of time to get these answers, and Matt's just being an idiot and going off on the wrong direction. And, so there is that element if you're going to play it as a competitive, but really these games shine as a cooperative, as Richard says, where we're all working together. I mean, it does suggest that each player would have, one player would have a notebook to write down clues, because you're going to need to review that at the end when you're answering questions.
Yeah.
But actually, what we did to make it more thematic, all of us had our own notepads, and we're all writing down our own notes.
Yeah, you end up writing some pretty weird stuff down because you don't know what's going to be important later on.
I did think if I suddenly died in suspicious circumstances and the police decide to investigate and they find my notepad and some of the notes I've taken on these adventures, you're gonna think I was involved in some really weird stuff.
I think you visited a lot of different embassies.
Yeah.
In the Sherlock Holmes one.
And just like you can get the penalties for visiting too many locations, you also get bonuses if you visit less locations than the respective sort of chief investigators.
Happened, has it?
No.
Yeah.
Both come with newspapers, as Richard was saying and showing you there, giving you some examples of. And the newspapers will give you information. Some of it is just thematic, some of it is nonsense. But mixed in amongst that are some vital clues that you may need both to help you with the investigation and when you come around to answering the questions at the end. Obviously, both are set in the distant past, although Mythos Tales is in a fictitious location. Believe us, if Arkham was real, we would have been there by now. Going insane. I say, they've both got the directories. Component-wise, the only major difference between the two is that, obviously, as I say, you can get penalties or bonus points depending on the amount of locations you visit. And that's the same with both of them. But only Mythos Tales gives you something to actually keep track of as a game component. So you've got a card and a token that you move every time you go to a different location from morning, afternoon, evening, and then on to the next day. Whereas with Sherlock Holmes, you just have to keep track of that yourself.
Probably in the notebook.
In the notebook, yeah. We just made a little tick every time we visited a new location.
He expects more of us than Dr. Armitage does in that one.
Yeah, I would say that, I mean, they are very similar games, but I would say that Sherlock Holmes is probably a tougher game to play and to get the questions right to at the end.
Yeah, well, I think partly that is the theme of it as well, because in Mythos Tales, you'll be investigating some guys that have been doing very weird things and reading an ancient book, and there's going to be a monster turn up at some point, isn't there? It's quite, once you do get to the right thread and you start following it, it's not too difficult. Whereas in the Sherlock Holmes one, obviously they're all regular people. It's just one of them is the murderer, and you have to. I mean, I think we figured out who the murderer was all right last time, didn't we? But some of the little details that it asks you about at the end, we hadn't quite got. I mean, we did just scrape past, didn't we?
We did.
We got it okay, but it's like he needs to know. Like, they need to know why he did it, and also like the circumstances of some of the. Like the reasons for some of the evidence that we found as well. Like there was a locked briefcase, wasn't there, that had been opened, and it's like when Holmes explains it all at the end, you think, oh yeah, it seems obvious. Like a lot like when you're watching Sherlock Holmes.
One
anyway.
could say it seems elementary, my dear.
You could say that, yeah, but but luckily Holmes would say that anyway, so we don't have to. But yeah, because it ends up being something like the briefcase was found quite far away from the body, so it's obviously been thrown, and there's scrape marks on it and things like that, and it's just things that we wouldn't really have put together into a narrative the way that Holmes did. So a lot of the time I think it is a good way to test whether you can actually do that kind of deduction that you see Sherlock Holmes do, even if you give yourself a lot more time than he had. Like we wandered to a lot more locations than he did and spent a lot more time on it. But that is the weird thing. Like, he's doing it at the same time. Yeah. So, basically, it seems a little bit pointless in a way, but I think he's meant to be training us in how to do it, isn't it?
In this, you're one of the Baker Street irregulars, aren't you?
That's it. Because you have another guy with you, don't you?
Yeah. I think, as well, with Sherlock Holmes, it is more difficult in the sense of there's a lot more little details you've got to pick up on as you go along. But you can kind of work out from the start, right, this is where I want to go and investigate, and it kind of you go quite naturally from one location to the next, because you've got different options, thinking, well, shall I go here, shall I go there, but there's always ones that seem stronger, and we actually finished and we scored all the questions right pretty much, didn't we? But there were still other locations we wanted to visit, but we didn't because we ran out of time. Whereas with Mythos Tales, there are lots of locations to visit, but you don't necessarily know at the start more than sort of one or two of those, and it can be quite easy to almost go into a dead end where you're thinking, okay, well, what should I do now? Where should I go? Even though every time we've played that, we've got really high scores. So it leaves you more confused and questioning your sanity, which is entirely thematic.
Yeah.
I do think that if people are looking at these two games and thinking, which one shall I get? Basically, if you don't like horror themes, if you don't like some of the conventions of the Lovecraft mythos, just stay away from this one. Because, as Richard says, you're going to get people reading from ancient books and weird stuff's going to happen, and monsters are going to turn up. And if you don't like that sort of thing, just avoid this. I know people who if I got this out and played this with them, they wouldn't like it, they wouldn't get into the theme, but would love Sherlock Holmes. Just like I've got friends who I think if I got Sherlock Holmes out to play with, they'd probably maybe like the mechanics of it, but wouldn't really get into the theme so much, and would love Mythos tales. So it really depends on what your interests are and what your group's going to be. Now, for me, and I think I speak for both of us here, we enjoyed playing these both very much, didn't we?
Yeah, we did. I mean, this is kind of more original, obviously, because like when you think of detectives, you immediately go to Sherlock Holmes. But I think, the Mythos tale one, with it being a little bit different, and there's always going to be something quite scary in it. I think I would probably enjoy Mythos tales more, but then we've played more of that, haven't we? I mean, you got that first, so we just thought that we really had to do at least one case in the Sherlock Holmes one, just to be able to compare them. So, but we did enjoy that. But I think still Mythos tales is probably a little bit better. And one of the things I like about that is it's all in that one book, isn't it?
Yeah.
So you have
we'll make
all
a note
different
on this.
cases are in there.
This is the Kickstarter edition, which means that it comes with a hardback case book. So all of the cases are in the one book, whereas with Consulting Detective Sherlock Holmes, each case has its own case book. Now, if you had the retail version of Mythos Tales, it would be the same. But I do like the fact that it is hardback and it's all, like you say, it's all in the one place.
Yeah, I think that there are. So this is the first case. So we've done that one now. So I don't think there's much replay value really, unless you wanted to just go through it yourself and just see what places you can wander to. But once you've done it once, you know who did it and everything. So
I don't think you're going to want to go back and replay that.
Yeah, but there are 9 more of them in here. 9 more cases. So.
Yeah, both of these games come with 10 in the game, 10 cases. This one's relatively new. This was only out last year. The original Sherlock Holmes was out in the 80s, I think, and this is, I believe, the 3rd edition of the game. Now, there was an expansion for that, the West End Adventures, which came out in 1995, I believe, originally, but it's recently been reprinted along with 4 new Jack the Ripper cases. So with this, you've got 2 maps. You've got 2 maps for this one. There is an extra 10 case booklets, 4 which are the Jack the Ripper cases, and an extra 6 which are the West End Adventures. It gives you a new map, which I must say I was very impressed with. It's very colourful. I think Richard's got that over here. It's a lot more colourful than either of the other maps, and I love the box, the way everything just slides out. I actually bought this from a website called the Board Game Hut, and it was the cheapest place I could get it delivered. I think it was about £33, something like that, but it was the cheapest one around. So if you want to get the expansion for that and get 10 more adventures for Sherlock Holmes, check out the Board Game Hut.
We'll have to try some of those and see if
these do
different.
look good. I've had a little look at this. The component quality of this is off the charts. One thing I would have to say as well about Mythos Tales and the original Sherlock Holmes, with this edition and some of the earlier editions, there was a lot of typos, printing errors, and in this,
elementary, my dear Watson.
if you are going to play Mythos Tales, look up the online FAQ and errata. One chap has very kindly been going through the Mythos Tales adventures and making an FAQ with some of the corrections, and I avoided it for the first one we looked at because I was worried about potential spoilers, but then I looked at it after we'd played it, and the way he'd done it is he's made a document, and when you're looking at the document, everything's pretty much almost white, so it's really difficult to see anything by mistake, but you've got it in big bold letters. If you go to such and such a location, read this. Right. So you can actually go through that errata and keep checking back to that without getting the spoilers, which is what I was worried about. But you can find that on the Board Game Geek. It's available to download as a PDF. Overall, Richard, what did you think of these two games? Are these games ones that you would recommend?
Yes, I would, because it is just kind of reading things with your friends, really, and doing an investigation at the same time. There are not a lot of rules that you would have to explain to someone. I mean, it seems a bit weird to us when we first started doing it, but what you could do, if you had some people around, you could do a Sherlock Holmes investigation, and you could kind of take the lead in that and say, like, we're going to go to this place first, and just do it in quite a narrative way. Like, I know that you have things like D6 and things like that, places to go to, which are like references on the map. But what you can do is just decide, like, well, I want to go and talk to the police at the police station, or the coroner, or I think we should go and investigate the factory where this person worked. And then, really, if your friends decide they want to go there, you could just look up in the little what's it called, the little directory, and then find where it is, and then you could just kind of do it like a proper story, really. I think this would be very easy for people to get into. Mythos Tales, because of the theme, not so much. I mean, I really like it, but I don't think I'd recommend that one quite as much as I would this one, just because this one's a bit more universal, I think. Yeah,
definitely that one is the more accessible one for people. And now, obviously, it's got more stories because you've now got the expansion for that. I do think, as Richard says, it very much feels like storytelling as a game. It feels like a choose-your-own-adventure novel. You're not really doing anything other than using your brain and thinking, well, where should I go next, and trying to pick up on the little details and looking at the map and looking at the paper. And I love that. That is brilliant. And having the newspapers that you can go through and trying to work out what's going to be relevant, what's not going to be relevant. It's all really good fun. And it's easy. As Richard says, you explain it so simply. It's just, you've got the book, you read the introduction to the case, you decide where you want to go first, and you make a note to say the time, and you take any relevant notes that you want to take. It is so much fun, and it really does feel, because you're taking notes in your journal, like you are working a case. Yeah. You know, and one day, we will outdo Sherlock Holmes.
Oh yeah. Well, now that we've got 20 cases to try,
we've got a lot of attempts to make. But there we have it. We have Sherlock Holmes and Mythos Tales. If you like them, if you like what we've been talking about, go check it out. Thank you.
Farewell, Quester. To find out about other productions by the Meddlesome Meeples, then check out our channel or rendezvous with us at meddlesomemeeples.com. Until next time, Quester, farewell, and keep thine axe sharp.